My name is Andrew Botterell. I'm a professor here at Western. I teach in the law school, so I recognize some of the people here. I also teach in philosophy. And I'm just going to, I'll say a little bit about the sponsors of today's panel. I'll introduce our panelists and then just explain how today's event is going to proceed. So today's panel is sponsored by three groups here at Western. One is the Public Law and Legal Philosophy Research Group at Western Law, which I am pleased to co-direct with my colleague Margaret Martin. There's the Center for Transitional Justice and Post-Conflict Resolution, which I believe Joanna and Valerie have running. And then there is either a group or an organization. Michael is very coy about its status, called Transitional Justice in the Law. I think the goal of this group is to organize panel discussions about current events in international law. I think there's going to be another panel or discussion later this term on international criminal law or the International Criminal Court. Yeah, so you can look for that. We're very happy to have three distinguished panelists here today to talk about the Syrian refugee crisis. Stephanie Bangarth, all right, is an associate professor of history at King's University College here at Western University. Her research interests are in human rights advocacy and in the immigrant experience in North America, with a particular research focus on Asian immigration and a personal interest in post-Second World War European refugee and immigrant history. And Stephanie also serves as the director of the collaborative graduate program in Migration and Ethnic Relations at Western. Next to Stephanie is Lina Hernandez. And she is an HR and communications manager at London Cross-Cultural Learner Centre, an organization that provides settlement services for refugees and newcomers in Canada. Lina graduated from La Sabana University, which I believe is in Bogota, with a bachelor's degree in law. And she was awarded a scholarship from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Colombia for a Master's of International Relations and Political Science, and she's currently completing an LL.M. Here at Western Law. And finally, to my immediate right is Michael Lynk. Michael's an associate professor of law at Western, where he teaches labor law, constitutional law, and human rights law. He was a practicing lawyer in Toronto and Ottawa for a decade before he became an academic, and his practice included immigration and refugee law. He has worked in the Middle East for the United Nations on refugee issues. He's published articles and co-edited a book on international law in the Middle East, and he's visited Syria on 3 occasions. So those are our panelists. So so we're they'll all each speak. Professor Lynk is going to go first, and he indicated that he'll address the origins and meaning of the civil war in Syria, how and why it began, why it became so serious, and the magnitude of the Syrian refugee crisis in the region. And Michael's going to do all that in 10 minutes. Lina will go next. She will explain the legal framework of the UN Refugee Convention and the obligations it imposes on potential receiving countries, particularly in Europe and Canada, and she's also been allotted 10 minutes for that. And finally, Professor Bangarth will address the issue of the Canadian government's response to the Syrian refugee crisis. She's been asked to provide some background in respect of Canada's response to previous refugee crises, such as those in Hungary, Chile, Uganda, and Vietnam, and she gets 15 minutes for that. So I'll try and be fairly strict with the panelists' time, simply because we want to leave enough time afterwards for questions and answers. I'll try and moderate the Q&A, so you don't have to address your questions to me, but I'll keep track of the hands that are up there, and I'll keep a list of people, and then you can just direct your questions to the panelists. Okay, so, you
Thank you very much for the introductions, Andrew, and thank you very much for agreeing to chair the panel today, and thank you for the very good turnout for today's issue. I'm here primarily to give you a background on the Syrian civil war and how it's created this huge refugee crisis. And so I'm basically here to provide a series of facts. I've got 10 minutes to do it in, so I'm going to be leaving out lots of things, and I hope I'm able to hit enough of the high points to provide context for what Lina and Stephanie are going to be providing. As Andrew mentioned, I had visited Syria on 3 occasions in the 1990s while working and traveling in the Middle East. And the first thing I want to be able to provide you with is a background to Syria. And complex country, so basically I'm restricted to being able to provide you two remarkable features that I think are relevant for today's discussion. The first of all is that it's a relatively heterogeneous society. There are a number of different peoples who end up living within its borders, and this explains, to one sense, the long relative stability that was in Syria, and the way in which communities live with each other in a fairly harmonious way. But it also has its own explanations for why that all fell apart in such a ferocious way. 85% of Syria are made of Syrian Arabs. The bulk of those in terms of religious denomination would be Sunnis, but there also are Alawites, who make up about 10% of the population. They are a branch of Shiite Islam. There has been, or was until the start of the war, a very significant Christian population at about 10%. There are also Druze populations, primarily in the south, and Circassians as well. Ethnically, besides the Arab population in Syria, there'd be the Kurds who live in the northeast and along the border with Turkey, who make up about 9 to 10% of the population, and smaller groups of Armenians and Turkmens as well. Syria was run and had lived in its own experience as a largely secular society. Although it was overwhelmingly Muslim, there were many mixed neighborhoods. You had to just wander through the beautiful old city of Damascus or Aleppo to see that. Christians in Syria tended to be much more open in their faith and their expression of their faith and the various different denominations they belonged to than some other neighboring countries. And I think of how much more closed it would be for Christians in, say Turkey or in Egypt. There was some intermarriage. So all in all, it led to a relatively, as I said, a very diverse culture. But the second important feature about Syria was that it was a dictatorship. It was a military dictatorship in civilian clothes. It gives new meaning to the idea of secular monarchies, and that there was a rule of 30 years by Hafez al-Assad, who died in 2000, and then was immediately succeeded by his son, Bashar al-Assad, who's been in power for the last 15 years. Both father and son come from the Alawites, the 10% of the community of Syria who live in and around the Mediterranean coast north of Lebanon. They belong to the Syrian Ba'athist Party. The Ba'athists is a long-standing Syrian nationalist movement that was particularly strong in Syria and in Iraq, also in Lebanon as well. They had been, the community had been primarily recruited into the military by the French during the French Mandate days, and they retained control of the military for the last 60 years as well. Dissent was unwelcome to Syria. Torture was widespread. All you have to do is think of the name Mahir Arar and know his own experiences. The Canadian computer engineer who had been deported to Syria in 2000, or rendered to Syria in 2002. His experience was shared by thousands and thousands of Syrians. Indeed, you go on the line for the web for one of the UN sites, nation sites. There's presently a very compelling exhibit on torture in Syria in the lobby of the UN building in New York. Of a photographer working for the Syrian military who was required to go and take pictures of every death caused in coming out of the Syrian prisons. And he was able to smuggle these on a number of USB sticks. He himself has been able to escape from Syria since. And the exhibit is a very chilling reminder of what many Syrians were opposed to. A number of groups would have prospered under the Assad regime, including the Christians in Syria, who felt quite protected by the Assads, as long as they didn't engage in politics. The dominant Sunni, the majority Sunni population felt quite excluded from the corridors of power. And of course, in any dictatorship, there is going to be a kleptomania with respect to economic privileges being given by the ruling clique as well. So the second thing I want to talk to you about very briefly is the origins of the Syrian civil war. We already know that the very beginnings of the Arab Spring in Tunisia, in Yemen, and particularly in Egypt, through the January and February of 2011 began to spread to other countries as well, including Libya and, to a smaller degree, in Lebanon as well. Protests began in March 2011 in the town of Dira in southern Syria, primarily as peaceful protests against the Assad-appointed governor of that particular protectorate in southern Syria. They were largely peaceful demonstrations meant to bring down what they thought was a corrupt rule by him, and also allegations of torture going on in the prisons in Dira. That was met, as protests were invariably met in Syria, with a very heavy hand by the Syrian military. Unarmed protesters were shot, and were shot again virtually every time they came out. The protests increased, still largely peaceful, and still largely were being gunned down. The message obviously being spread by the Assad regime was that there was no room for peaceful protest, and there was going to be no budding of any Arab Spring in Syria. So what began as a relatively hopeful side of protest with democratic aspirations then turned fairly quickly, within a couple of months, to an armed struggle against the Assad regime. Arms first crossing into Syria in the south, but other communities began to rise up against the Assad regime throughout Syria. Primarily, it was Sunni opposition to the Assad regime, and the initial opposition groups to him were made up primarily of both of moderate and of fundamental Islamists. Then, before very long, you begin to get a lot of external hands being played in the pro and con in Syria. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Turkey, Qatar, and then the United States and Europe began to line up with the armed opposition against Assad. Assad had received its primary arms supplies from Russia, and also received an immense amount of support coming from Iran. He could count on support from Iraq as well, and to a lesser degree from China. And increasingly, his army and troops were getting both arms, but also a lot of military training from Hezbollah, the Shiite party in Lebanon. This all deteriorated into a very complex three-way civil war by 2012, where you had the Assad regime and its army, who primarily controlled the area in and around Damascus, and the Alawite stronghold along the Mediterranean Sea, and through some parts in the south. You had the Free Syrian Army, which was made up of the original moderate Syrian opposition to him. And then you had a third front emerging, which was the ISIS and the Al-Qaeda network in Syria, known as the Al-Nusra Front. And it was a three-sided front of all against all. You had each of them dependent upon foreign funding, foreign weapons, and sometimes even foreign fighters coming to join them. And the tragedy then, since 2012 up until today, is none of the three sides are weak enough to lose, nor are they strong enough to wind up winning. All of this then has had a significant impact upon the Syrian people. This has been an absolute disaster for them, and it's now caused the single largest refugee crisis in the world today. Keep this in mind, there are 60 million refugees in the world today, according to the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission on Refugees. This is a higher number than the number of refugees at the peak of World War II. There has not been this many refugees in human memory. The Syrian refugees account for over 4 million refugees externally, and another 7, approaching 8 million refugees displaced internally within Syria. And I'll take you through more of that in a few minutes. The death toll in the 4.5-year-old civil war is now at around 235,000 people. Estimated around 60 to 70% of that is civilian. The Assad regime in particular has used chemical weapons, has used barrel bombs, cluster bombs, sieges against his opponents, which includes generally the civilian population. This is a civil war that's being fought primarily in the towns and cities and in the densely packed neighborhoods. So when there are attacks by one side against another, invariably it's including its attacks against the civilian populations who are caught up in between.
Michael,
Yeah.
how strict do you want me to be?
Relatively strict. I'm getting close to the end, if you believe it. So give me 2 minutes, and I promise I'll be done.
So not very.
All sides have been guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity with respect to this. And I'm going to show you a couple of slides. The refugee family you saw here is a Kurdish family from Kobani, which is in the north, right on the border with Turkey, which was heavily shelled. And it gives you a sense of some of the. This is also a picture from Kobani, taken by the UN of the center of Kobani. And apparently, virtually, if you see aerial pictures of this, the whole city looks like this collapsed and ruined neighborhoods. This is a map of Syria. You can see Damascus in the lower left-hand corner. Red is indicating where government support is the strongest. So in and around Damascus and in the villages and towns surrounding Damascus, primarily under government control, though there was active fighting against some of the moderate opposition in some of the suburbs of Damascus. In the south, it's contested control between the opposition and the Syrian army. You can see the red in the upper left-hand corner. That is the Alawite stronghold in and around the Mediterranean Sea. Just cut off the top of the map would be the Kurds in the north have primarily armed themselves sufficiently that they can keep all three groups out of Kurdistan. And most, you see the ISIS would be in the west of Syria, primarily pouring over the border coming from Iraq, and the more moderate opposition is fighting north of the Alawite stronghold in the northwest of the country. This is a picture of the city of Homs, but this actually could be any one of the major cities. This is a picture taken by satellite in August 2010, about 6 months before the war began. This is a central neighborhood that Homs has had a long history of rebellion against the Alawite rule and against the Assad regime. So this is taken a little more than 2 years later, and you can see the difference in the devastation. Bombed from the air by barrel bombs and by regular munitions against the center of that neighborhood. It gives you an idea of the scale. This is a map with respect to where the refugees are. This was done in March. It's the best recent map I could find. The numbers have always changed upwards since then. Turkey is now estimated to have actually over 2 million refugees. Lebanon, which is a country, after all, Lebanon is a country of 4 million people. Over a quarter of its population right now are Syrian refugees. And you add on to the top of that, around 15% of the population are Palestinian refugees left over from 1948 and 1967. That country is coming close to 40 to 45% of it. The people living there are refugees right now. And then there are large camps in Jordan, right along just south of the border. And there's smaller groups of refugees in Iraq and other surrounding countries. It's primarily the refugees who are in the camps in Turkey that have been started on migration, heading to Europe. So the last thing I want to say is the international community. There have been fleeting attempts at diplomatic solutions, particularly since 2012. There were conferences in Geneva, both in 2012 and 2014, with the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. In 2012, it collapsed over whether or not any UN response would allow Bashar al-Assad to stay in power. It collapsed again in 2014, but this time over whether or not Iran would be a part of the negotiations. We're trying to find a solution in Syria. The attempts by the UN Security Council itself to broker a deal have met with a little bit of success, in the sense it was efforts through the Security Council that was able to get Assad regime to surrender most, not all, of its chemical weapons. But there's been a greater failure at the Security Council, mostly by vetoes coming from Russia and China, with respect to trying to create a UN peacekeeping force and some kind of post-Civil War resolution to all this. I just end off with this. If anything, I'd say, despite the ferocity of the Civil War and the carnage to date, I think there's an uptick in a little bit of hope for a fact of trying to end the Civil War and stem the refugee crisis. I say that for 2 reasons. One is the mere fact of the refugee crisis itself. The fact that it has spilled instilled in the world's conscience, I think has given a greater popular boost to try and find some diplomatic way of trying to end the war. And the second reason why is because of the recent agreement with Iran over the nuclear weapons treaty that it signed with the P5+1. This brings Iran back into the diplomatic world. And more importantly, I think it brings Iran, who has a great deal of say over what will be happening in Syria. I don't think you can find a lasting resolution in Syria without some of the regional players playing a strong role. Turkey in particular, but mostly because it's on the side of Assad, Iran as well. So that is my 10.5 minutes overview. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. My name is Lina and I work currently with the London Cross-Cultural Learner Center, and we basically receive, host, and have in our premises refugees from around the world, and now we're seeing more Syrians coming. Right now we have 25 families from Syria living with us, so we're happy that there's more to come. So this is just the start of the process. Today I'm going to be talking about the 1951 convention. So it's a little bit dry, talking about legislation, but hopefully we'll go, and I'm going to be speaking fast because I have a lot to cover in just 10 minutes. So basically, through history, states have been granting protection to people fleeing persecution for centuries. However, the modern refugee regime is a product of the second half of the 20th century. Modern refugee law has its origins in the aftermath of World War I, when millions of people fled their homelands in search of refuge, and governments created international agreements to provide travel documents for them. So that's basically what it was. They are considered the first refugees of the 20th century. The number of refugees increased during and after World War II, creating the need for clear international guidelines, laws, and conventions to protect the human rights of refugees. The process started with the League of Nations in 1921, and in 1948 the Universal Declaration of Human Rights protected the right to seek and enjoy asylum in other countries. In July of 1951, a diplomatic conference in Geneva adopted the convention related to the status of refugees, which is known as the 1951 Convention, which was later amended by the 1967 Protocol, which basically removed the geographical and time limitations. This initially was created only for Europeans involved in events occurring before January 1st, 1951. Okay, so the Convention and the Protocol have also helped inspire important regional instruments. So these are listed. I'm not going to go over each one of them. Some examples: the 1969 OAU Refugee Convention in Africa, the 1984 Cartagena Declaration in Latin America, and the development of a common asylum system in the European Union. The convention is important because it was the first truly international agreement covering the most fundamental aspects of refugees' life. It spelled out a set of basic human rights which should be at least equivalent to the freedoms enjoyed by foreign nationals living legally in a given country, and in many cases those of citizens of that state. The convention defines what the term refugee means, and it outlines the refugee's rights, obligations, and it also spells out people or groups of people who are not covered by the convention. Okay, so what are the obligations of the receiving countries? The convention recognizes the international scope of refugee crisis and the need of international cooperation, including burden sharing among states. The states parties share a common goal of providing protection to individuals forced to flee because their countries are unable or unwilling to protect them. The 1951 Convention does not define how state parties are to determine whether an individual meets the definition of a refugee. Instead, the establishment of asylum proceedings and refugee status determinations are left to each state party to develop. Each government creates its own asylum laws based on their different resources, such as national security concerns and also previous experiences with forced migration movements. So everything is based on the responsibility to protect, but that is an international, which international legal implications are not immediately clear. It has two portions of it. The first part is that states have the responsibility to protect their own populations from mass atrocities. This is deeply embedded in existing international law and has been applied before. The second part of the responsibility to protect is that of bystander states, known as the international community. And they have a collective responsibility to assist host states in protecting their population and to act to protect these populations in situations where host states in failing to do so. This is the portion of the responsibility to protect that is much less established in international law and is currently developing. In Canada, the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, IRPA, that it replaced the Immigration Act of 1976, is the primary federal legislation regulating immigration to Canada. And it creates a high-level framework detailing the goals and guidelines the Canadian government has set with regards to immigration into Canada by foreign residents. One of the objectives that is embedded in the legislation is to offer safe haven to persons with a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group, as well as those at risk of torture or cruel and unusual treatment or punishment. The Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations, IRPR, contains the laws created to fit within the IRPA in order to specify how the IRPA is to be applied. The Convention also states some of the refugees' rights that are present in the Convention, such as the right not to be expelled except under certain strictly defined conditions, the right not to be punished for illegal entry into the territory of a contracting state, the right to work, to housing, to education, to public relief and assistance, freedom of religion, access to courts, freedom of movement within the territory, and the right to be issued identity and travel documents. Also, the refugees are required to respect the laws and regulations of their country of asylum. The Convention also makes a definition of a refugee as a person who is outside his or her country of nationality or habitual residence, has a well-founded fear of persecution because of his or her race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion, and is unable or unwilling to avail himself or herself of the protection of that country or return there for fear of persecution. So there's a couple of elements to the definition. First, they have crossed an international border into a second country. They are forced to flee because of the threat of persecution and because they lack the protection of their own country, and they cannot return safely to their homes in the circumstances. Different from a migrant, who is a person that leaves his or her country for many reasons that are not related to persecution, such as for the purpose of employment, family reunification, or study. There's another group within migrants, economic migrants, that leaves a country voluntarily to seek a better life. The difference between a migrant and a refugee is a migrant continues to enjoy the protection of his or her own government, even when abroad, and they are free to return safely to their countries if they wish to. There's some people that are not covered in the Convention as refugees. So persons who have committed crimes against peace, a war crime, crimes against humanity, or a serious non-political crime outside the country of refuge. It's important to remember that a refugee is a civilian, not a soldier, although former soldiers may qualify. And internally displaced persons, IDPs, are still subject to the laws of their country until they are able to cross the border. That's it.
For my participation in this panel. It's very nice as a Canadian historian to be able to comment not only on the past, but also on current events. So I'm usurping, I suppose, the role of some political scientist, and I'm happy to do that. Before I begin my talk as well, I'd like to acknowledge something, the history of the traditional territory in which Western University operates. I think it's important to note that the Arawandaren, the neutral peoples, once settled this region, alongside the Algonquin and the Haudenosaunee peoples who used this land for their traditional beaver hunting territories. And I think that's important to note because it underlines the fact that ultimately we are all newcomers and immigrants to this society here in Canada. The question today to ponder, at least that I've been asked to ponder, is have we done enough for the Syrian refugee crisis? So with a little history, with a little politics, and hopefully some of your feedback, I think we'll come to maybe a verdict, at least in this room, temporarily. I've got some quotes here, and the first two here, quotes at the top, are separated by a mere 5 years, but I think those two statements by F.C. Blair and Stanley Knowles reveal much about the historic contradictions in Canadians' approach to dealing with refugee crises. In fact, remove those dates, 1938 and 1943, they can equally apply to statements being made today for the current Syrian refugee crisis, in which there are more than, as Michael noted, 60 million refugees fleeing war, persecution, and danger, a number, as Michael already noted, which surpasses that which we saw at the end of the Second World War, when, for example, this is a picture of my father, the little child there, and my grandparents, when they fled Hungary from Soviet persecution in the late 1940s and into the early 1950s, when they finally came to Canada in '51, but not before spending 6 years stateless in Austria. They were among the over 120,000 plus refugees from Europe that made their way to Canada between 1947 and 1953, thanks to contract labor schemes, or government, family, or church sponsorships. Make no mistake, of course, the selection criteria at this particular point in time in Canadian history was guided by a considerable amount of racial and political bias, along with, of course, a heavy dose of economic self-interest, which has always characterized our immigration policy in Canadian history. But it is to note that of all the elements in Canadian immigration history, it's the refugee policy and the refugee history and the admission of refugees that seems to garner the most controversial and the most criticized aspects amongst both politicians and civil society at large. But for much of Canadian history, it should be noted, we haven't even had official Canadian refugee policy. From the first refugees that we took in, I'd like to say that the African Americans who fled via the Underground Railroad can be certainly considered, or at least certainly considered as some of our earliest refugees. It wasn't until the passage of the 1976 Immigration Act that refugees constituted an admissible class for resettlement in Canada. Up until that time, special refugee admission schemes were made possible only with the passage of orders in council, which suspended normal immigration streams and regulations and permitted relaxed criteria for screening. So refugee policy in particular is very new from a Canadian historical standpoint. Fast forward to today, and a United Nations report reveals that Canada is at the bottom of a top 15 list of industrialized receiving countries, with 13,500 claims reported in 2014. In comparison, Sweden, a small Nordic country with 9.6 million people and a quarter of Canada's population, admitted 75,100 refugees last year. Just to give you a sense here where we've waxed and waned on the historic scale of refugee admission in Canada. We weren't always so unwelcoming, but we weren't exactly an open door since the end of World War II. I'd argue that the reputation that we do have today as a world leader in protecting refugees is due more largely to people, the Canadian people. And this was something that the United Nations, the UNHCR, recognized when it awarded Canada, the Canadian people, the Nansen Medal in 1986 for refugee and immigration reception. It was to the Canadian people. It was the first time that that medal had been awarded to a group, to a country of people, rather than to individuals. In 1958, it was the Canadian people acting in concert with humanitarian and voluntary agencies, the Canadian Red Cross in particular, who called on the Liberal government to take in Hungarians who were fleeing the violent Soviet repression during the Hungarian Revolution in 1956 to 1957. And it was in response to significant public pressure that the Canadian Embassy in Vienna loosened normal entry requirements concerning proper travel documentation, medical exams, and security clearances, and enlisted commercial airplanes to transport refugees out of Austria to Canada. The Canadian government also increased its monetary aid to the Canadian Red Cross to assist with that particular refugee crisis in Hungary and in the surrounding countries at this particular time, and the effort produced impressive results. By the end of 1957, more than 37,000 Hungarians had been accepted into Canada, and this was done despite a rising unemployment rate at the time and suspicion of Hungarians as being communists coming to Canada to infiltrate. And thanks to that wellspring of support, my great-aunt and uncle were able to come to Canada in January of 1957, following a harrowing crossing over the Hungarian-Austrian border. It was my uncle's second attempt. His first attempt met with failure when his friend, who he was trying to attempt the first crossing with, was killed by a Russian border guard. My uncle was sent to a work camp in Russia for 6 months as punishment. So the Hungarian crisis really tells us, at least in that particular time, of the limits of what individuals can do. In this case, Canadians were concerned. But it's also the limits of what individuals can do in an international system founded on the primacy of the nation state. The response of Canadians was an important catalyst, I think, for mobilizing action around the whole issue of the refugee at the time. But it had the unanticipated effect of heightening the expectation that Canadians would have going forward about how their government should deal with refugees and how organizations should be able to participate fully in the whole manner of refugee reception and perhaps even policy building. So while the Hungarian refugees were fleeing a communist state and welcomed as democratic refugees for the most part in 1957, Chilean refugees fleeing a fascist state were viewed with suspicion in 1973 when 7,000 Chilean and other Latin American refugees were admitted to Canada after the violent coup d'etat there, when Salvador Allende's democratically elected socialist communist government was overthrown, and then instilled with a new military ruler, General Augusto Pinochet. Although Canada took refugees in at that time, it did so exceedingly grudgingly. And despite pressure from Amnesty International, Church, Labor, and Latin American groups, the government was slow to react, not wanting to antagonize Chile's new administration, which was supported by the United States. And also, many in the Pierre Trudeau government at the time painted the Chilean refugees as subversives, as possible leftist terrorists, and were concerned about the kinds of people that Canada was admitting in 1973. The government at the time was certainly out of step with what other nations were doing, including Holland and Sweden, who were treating the Chilean refugees outside of the normal flow of immigrants. And only after considerable outcry, as I mentioned, from civil society groups across Canada did the situation change. I note a newspaper article out there because, again, this refugee crisis was met with a considerable amount of opposition. In January 14, 1974, this newspaper article from the Toronto Star carried a story of a small group of protesters parading in front of the Walker House Hotel in Toronto, where a number of Chilean refugees were being temporarily housed. Their placards, if you can't read from the back, read a number of things such as "Death to the Red Pest," "No More Marxists," "FLQ was enough." So you have the sense of Canadians conflating current issues, domestic issues, with international issues, and keep Marxist gangsters out of Canada. So the slow response in this Chilean case led many to become increasingly suspicious of Ottawa's commitments to refugees. But that would not last long because in 1979, and by mid-1979, nearly 1.5 million refugees fled their homes in Southeast Asia. In June of 1979, the Canadian government announced that 60,000 Indo-Chinese refugees would be resettled in this country by the end of 1980. So that's in a year and a half, 60,000 people in a year and a half from Southeast Asia. And this whole reception of the Southeast Asia, or the Indo-Chinese, gave rise to a new refugee stream program called the Private Sponsorship of Refugees Program, something that we still have a holdover of today. Popular pressure in this case, again, forced the government to adjust upwards its commitment to taking in refugees at that time. And as a result, from the years 1978 to 1981, refugees made up 25% of all immigrants to Canada. A pretty remarkable number. In the summer of 1999, fast forwarding a little bit more, several hundred undocumented Fujianese migrants, Chinese from the Fujian province, arrived on Canada's west coast, giving rise to what many news medias reported as a refugee crisis. There was considerable hand-wringing and teeth gnashing about the possible security, moral, political, and well-being of the nation. That was in 1999. The alarmist reaction of the Canadian government in August of 2010, and Canadians themselves, to the arrival of the MV Sun-C carrying Tamil refugee claimants to the west coast in October of that year, is consistent again with our mixed history of refugee reception. Public Safety Minister at the time, Vic Taves, warned that this was a test boat, with hundreds of thousands, possibly more boatloads of Tamils coming to overwhelm Canadian refugee system. In reality, there were 492 claimants on the vessel, which represented about 1.5% of the 34,000 refugee claimants that Canada received in that year. In response to the crisis, there were calls to that Canada should get tough with refugee claimants, to incarcerate all the passengers, and possibly create new laws to fend off this latest threat to Canada. In response, there was the passage of Bill C-31, known as the Protecting Canada's Immigration System Act, in our Parliament. To say that this piece of legislation has been sadly criticized by a variety of civil society groups would be an understatement. So where are we in terms of our numbers? Here's some numbers again. In 1956, well, here we are, 45 to 52, some 40,000 Ukrainians amongst the 120,000 refugees from Europe, 37,000 Hungarian refugees, 10,000 Czech refugees in the aftermath of the Prague Spring in 1968. In 1972, an interesting group came to Canada, nearly 8,000 Ugandan Asians, the majority of whom were Muslims. I have a PhD student, Shazan Muhammadi, who's working on that particular migrant or refugee reception for his doctoral thesis. Again, the Chileans fleeing, the Indo-Chinese boat people, more recently 11,000 refugees from the breakup of the former Yugoslavian nations. And over the course of 2006 to 15, Canada has taken in 14,000 Colombians as well, Colombian refugees. Karen refugees from Burma, 2009 to 2015, and from 2009 to 2015, almost 23,000 Iraqis. What's the right number? It's really hard to know. There's no right answer. But still, I'd like to suggest that our record is mixed, even as most Canadians seem to favor asylum provisions. No one should forget that in 1930s Canada, none was too many for the Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany. And I have this picture here of the Komagani Maru, in which 374 Sikh passengers who came from India in May of 1914 were turned back and were ultimately received a deadly encounter with police and troops near Kolkata on their return to India. So, more recently, we've also seen cuts to refugee health care, mandatory detention for irregular arrivals, including children, and government money spent on billboards in Hungary to stem the tide of Roma asylum seekers to Canada. So our risk here is that we risk again becoming rather contemptible, perhaps, with our refugee reception and our history, and turning our history perhaps a little bit backwards in time to that pre-1940s period. So what have we done today? To date, according to Citizenship and Immigration Canada, we've taken in, or Canada has taken in about 2,400 Syrian refugees between January 2014 and August 2015, out of a total of nearly about 23,000 refugees in 2014 altogether. On September 19th of this year, in response to public pressure, the federal government issued a bit more of a broader statement on their pledge to aid Syrian refugees. The initial pledge in 2013 was to accept 1,300 refugees by the end of 2014. The 10,000 pledge was done in January of this year to accept 10,000 Syrian refugees over the next 3 years. The reality, of course, has been a little less than that, or quite a bit less than that. More recently, on September 19th of this previous month, what I call the 10,000 Pledge Part 2, in which Canada promised to accept up to 10,000 Syrian refugees in 15 months. It's important to note that that's still the initial commitment that was given in January. However, it's sped up by 15 or so months. All right. It's still an important step forward, certainly, as groups of Canadians will now be able to submit settlement applications for individual refugees, since also the September 19th announcement meant that Syrian and Iraqi refugees who are outside their country will now automatically be considered refugees, so that's a helpful step forward. But there's no commitment from the government as to how long these applications will now take to be processed. We do know that wait times in Amman, Jordan currently stand at about 19 months and 45 months in Ankara, Turkey. So it's over 4 years. Unfortunately, the government's made no commitment to increasing the number of Syrian refugees who may come to Canada. Only those that it's committed to will get here sooner. All right, which is, again, a good announcement, but is it enough? I think it's deeply disappointing considering our history, what we do know about what we've been able to do in the past. And certainly there have been individuals such as General Rick Hillier and Romeo Dallaire who have called for much more. No commitment was unfortunately made also on September 19th regarding expediting visas for Syrians with family ties in Canada, a measure that would significantly help a number of people as well, including the family of the Kurdi family of the child who we all know who was found on that beach that prompted a widespread international outcry. There's no commitment that these 10,000 refugees will also not displace Canada's commitment to resettlement from other refugee-producing nations such as Eritrea, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia, for example. It was also troubling in that pledge as well to hear references in the announcement from the minister conflating refugees and terrorists. No one has suggested in large portion that Syrian refugees should be exempted from Syrian screening, in fact. But the gratuitous, I think, suggestion that there's a significant likelihood of jihadi terrorists hiding among refugees coming to Canada calls to mind what I remember reading about Hungarians being conflated with communists, with Chileans being conflated with communists, and that kind of discourse that was so common at this time when we were waging a sort of a war against communists. Again, there's some more aspects here about the September 19th announcement. Canada's response largely hasn't, I think, met the standard of what its previous responses has been historically to refugees. For example, back in 1999, Canada responded rapidly to the call for help from ethnic Albanian refugees in Kosovo during the war in the Balkan countries, bringing in 250 people a day between May 4th and 23rd in 1999. Some other announcements, as you can see here, we all know that Ontario has pledged help as well. There's the Syrian Emergency Relief Fund more broadly. Lifeline Syria plans to bring in 1,000 Syrian refugees to Toronto. And of course, from everyday examples of Canadian Generosity included the Dewson Student Public School in Toronto, where students pledged on their own a primary school to sponsor a refugee family. Other responses are also well known. Some of you may have taken part in a number of refugee walks and talks, perhaps, demonstrations. A number of universities have issued challenges, including our own university, the Western Social Science Refugee Sponsorship Fund. So these are some things that one can do. The picture sort of in the middle here of the family with Reverend Mike Bouchard is at my own university, at King's University College. Since January to August of this year, our community has raised over $55,000 to bring in 6 refugees, including this family, both of whom are from, one of whom is from Syria and the other one is from from Iraq. So there are some practical ways that what Canada can do to address perhaps this situation, what Canadians can do in terms of policy or international affairs, relations options. There are a couple of ideas here that I've culled from some folks that I've spoken to and some things that I've read. But more importantly, I think what I would encourage you to do as an individual, you can donate your time or money if you like, but I think that the more important thing that we can do is, as you're doing today, is to be engaged, read about it, talk about it, ask questions, and hold to account, I think, those who are currently making policy, and those who will be possibly making policy in perhaps under 2 weeks' time. Be part of an informed and engaged citizenry, because we are so incredibly fortunate to be living in Canada, and reject the divisive discourse that takes away, I think, from finding solutions. And I'd like to close with a statement. This is sort of a horrible paraphrase, but 2,000 years ago, the great Rabbi Hillel posed 3 rhetorical questions. If I am not for myself, who is for me? But if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? Paraphrasing that question, if we are only for ourselves, then what are we? These are questions that I hope prompt us to think more broadly, now on the Syria issue, perhaps on October 19th, and hopefully in the days ahead of all the days of our lives. Thank you.
So we have about 20 minutes for questions.
Yes, thank you very much. This is all very gripping, but I just want to go right to the beginning. Professor Michael, I really appreciated your overview of the Syrian situation, but history continues, and Russia has been involved as of the last 3 days. Does that change your positive view with mentioning Iran and the nuclear realities that have happened some weeks ago?
It's cautionary. I mean, the Russian support for Bashar al-Assad is not diminished. And Assad will continue to remain in power as long, and give no thought of wanting to step down, as long as the Russians keep on giving him financial aid and funding to be able to continue with the war. Russia, I think, is seen this primarily as a military, as a diplomatic friend to want to support militarily. So until the Russians decide to engage in an active diplomatic solution to the end of the war, that's probably a negative with respect to how soon we're going to get a final resolution to the Syrian civil war. And as you know, I mean, the allegations is that his bombing in the last several days have not been against ISIS, but have been against the successor to the Free Syrian Army, which is annoyed the United States. So if that means that there's a greater distance between the U.S. and the United States and Russia with respect to trying to find a solution, I suspect it's not helpful at all. I still maintain that there's more optimism today than there was maybe 4 or 5 months ago. But the Russian activities in aiding him are not going to help towards the end of the war.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think my question is going to go to the panelists. Of course, it has been mentioned that the response of Syrian government to the peaceful protesters of last time in the course of the current civil war and subsequent refugee crisis. So what is the response of rich Gulf countries like Syria, because I've never heard of even one single refugee from Syria going to Saudi Arabia or even to Arab Emirates, which are very rich countries as well. So, and also, of course, the Canadian response to the refugee crisis in the Middle East, of course, it is in line with the Western policies of how they accommodate refugees. So what do you say about the Gulf countries themselves, those who are neighboring to Syria? They have not taken even a single person. What do you say about that?
If you want me to start, that has been a criticism raised by Human Rights Watch, and particularly by Kenneth Roth, their executive director, in an op-ed he had several weeks ago. And I think he started off by a Twitter feed, which says how many refugees have Syrian refugees have Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and the other Gulf Emirates received. He said exactly 0. It's hard to tell because there are approximately 500,000 Syrians that are in Saudi Arabia today. I don't think Saudi Arabia has any form of refugee determination system in the way in which we know here in Canada or in the West. So it's hard to tell how many of those Syrians are those who've been escaping the war as opposed to those who maybe have been economic migrants to Saudi Arabia in the years before the war began. So I caution when people raise that issue to keep that in mind. But I don't want for a second to sound like an apologist for Saudi Arabia or any of the other Gulf countries. They've been particularly destructive in terms of their heavy financing to continue the war through some of their money and some of their arms are actually finding their way to ISIS and to the al-Nusra front, which is not helpful. They again see a military solution to the Syrian crisis, and that means the removal of Bashar al-Assad. And until they change their mind, I think there may be a negotiated diplomatic solution. They're not playing a helpful role.
And I think too, let's not forget that this is an international humanitarian crisis, and so I also am a little cautious about focusing on the Gulf states and their culpability or lack or inaction on this issue, because I worry about it taking away from what other nations who historically participated in international humanitarian crises, what they're not doing. So let's not point at some nations and going, well, there's some people who are at least worse than us and doing less than us. So I also caution about focusing on that. It certainly is obviously something that is a concern, but as a Canadian, I want my government to do something. I'm concerned about what's going on with the Gulf states, but as a Canadian, I want my government to be held to a greater level of responsibility because I've elected them.
Okay.
This is a little bit more usual question, but the German foreign minister recently stated that they're going to make an effort to determine who's an economic migrant and a refugee. I just wanted to know a little bit about what type of evidentiary burden these refugees have to make, and how might it compare to the immigration and refugee board in this country?
Each country has their own process to establish the refugee status, but there's specific elements that a refugee would have to prove, and as you can imagine, it's difficult because of the circumstances that the people are fleeing their countries in terms of documentation. But basically, at the refugee camps, they have the first intake of resettlement and settlement. And right now, it's a reality that's happening that many people are fleeing as economic migrants, and they are just taking advantage of the crisis just to get to Europe and start a better life. It's going to be a big process, years of process in the host countries to determine that. Some migrants that are coming due to economic reasons are going to be successful in just basically taking advantage of the process, and some others are probably going to be not successful through the process. But it's a reality, it's happening. It's also another part of that people that are getting to Europe right now, some of them, not all of them, of course, because we cannot generalize in anything. They are the ones that have reasons to get there. It's not resources in actually getting to Europe. So it's going to be very difficult to separate which is fleeing because of economic reasons and finding a better life, and which one are actually fleeing because of refuge. It's going to be years, and it will depend on each country and on their process. But it's happening for sure.
I have a few questions actually, if that's okay. First, it appears to me, and maybe I'm wrong characterizing this, but the refugee crisis post-World War II seemed a lot more urgent, perhaps, maybe because of the nature of the global conflict. But do you think this characterization that I just made is true? And could it be, if that is true, is it a lack of preparation that people have made that's preventing them, or is it an excuse, or how do you feel about that, as far as how they compare, as far as preparation to accept refugees? Is that the main issue?
So I see there's sort of two parts to your question here, whether or not the situation is similar in terms of preparation, and then also what that means today, right? So in the late 1940s, following the Second World War, certainly the world community and those who were on the side of the winners and those who were losers in that conflict cooperated to the extent that they did in the vein of the United Nations to work out how refugees would be distributed across Europe and then into North America. So in terms of preparation, where you have international bodies like the UN, the Red Cross, I would say that there was preparation following the Second World War that I don't think can be compared to what's going on today. By and large, I think because the two conflicts are almost completely dissimilar. So in the sense, I guess I'm saying, in the historical past, we have sort of been organized, but we really only have been organized in response to large refugee crises back in that late 1940s period. Up until that time, we've really taken a very ad hoc approach towards refugee crises, to be quite honest with the historical record. And I don't think that it's an excuse to say that, I think it's an excuse to say that perhaps we weren't prepared at this time. Because the Syrian crisis, the Syrian civil war has been going on for such a long time, precipitated by the Arab Spring, as Michael mentioned, I think it does us a disservice as Canadians to say that we weren't prepared, and also the international community. I think it allows them to get off rather lightly in something that people were acknowledging has been an issue for at least now 4 years. So whether or not it's a willful ignorance of what's going on or a lack of preparedness, I aim more on the side of willful ignorance.
Right. Yeah, that's what I kind of thought, because it's going on since at least 2012, as you said. So to say we aren't prepared is kind of,
and to say that we
covering our
couldn't
ass.
figure out policies in advance of this is really disingenuous to a crisis that's not really a crisis, but it's becoming almost a tragic daily war.
And just,
Yeah, go ahead.
questions back there.
Sure.
Just not
Sure.
So just at the very back, yeah.
Oh, right. My question revolves around the U.S. response to the crisis and also the possibility of introducing another factor, another parameter to consider, because so far it's always been humanitarian. But I feel like there might be reason to bring in another parameter, which is vested interest, security interest, conflict interest, because as you know, America, I feel personally that America made a mistake with the Iraq War, and that might have created more terrorism, more conflict, more backlash against the West than otherwise, and we normally would have had if the Iraq War hadn't happened. And there was Guantanamo Bay, which also contributed to a lot of negative perceptions in the East against the West. And even now, it is kind of arisen that it's become known that America was behind, in some ways, complicit in forming ISIS. So all these refugees, which you say are 60 million in number, they feel that America is somehow directly or indirectly involved in the mess that was created in their own land, in all the strife and troubles that they're going through. So do you feel that in America they understand the gravity of the situation where what would unfold if they didn't take a war-scale effort to really help these refugees out as fast as possible, as quick as possible, as, I don't know, as nicely as possible? And if they don't, what do you think can be done to make them aware of this possibility of like creating more terrorism, creating more hatred against the West?
I'm not sure I can answer the question, so that's why I'm looking at you.
I'm not sure I can really speak for any kind of an American situation. I lived in the U.S. for a while. I'm not sure. I don't want to be glib to answer that question at all, but I think we're kind of dealing with sort of similar questions in Canada when we hear that rhetoric about security versus humanitarian impulse. And, you know, I think there's always that balancing act that needs to go on. I don't know what to say with regard to encouraging Americans to become more aware of the impact of their policies internationally. I think that's a long history.
I meant, like the security issue in Canada is that, oh, they might be terrorists coming in, the refugees. But I mean, if we don't act, if we don't respond, it would create more terrorists. It would create more, it would incite more people towards violence because they're just unhappy with their situation.
Well, I do know that the American government has recently announced that they're going to be taking in something on order of, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I read about 100,000 refugees from Syria, which is not an insignificant number. So maybe in that gesture, there is some recognition that perhaps a more agreeable reception policy with regard to the Syrian refugee crisis may in fact be an appropriate response to address the concerns that you mentioned.
I wish it was that large. I think we're much closer to 10,000 from the Americans. They've admitted 1,300 so far, so it's a pitiful number.
I'm going to exercise my right and just ask one quick question. Can you talk about the appropriate unit of analysis? So this panel has been called the Syrian Refugee Crisis, but in the media you often hear talk about the European refugee crisis, and Michael alluded to a global refugee crisis. And I'm just wondering, maybe the answer is you should think in terms of all of those things, but you know, Eritrea has a refugee crisis, Sudan has a refugee crisis, Libya. I look for generalization, so maybe there's something to be said that there's something going on in all of these countries that is leading to this. But I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about what is the should we think about this in global terms? Is that helpful? Is that not the right unit of analysis?
Well, we always have to think of this in global terms. If it helps at all, in terms of refugee-producing countries right now, the largest is Afghanistan, but Syria is close behind. They both are in the range of between 4 and 5 million refugees outside of their borders caused by internal conflict. Somalia is the third largest Democratic Republic, and the Sudan. So you're looking at a sphere, a precedent of refugees going from Africa over to Central Asia. And in terms of internal displaced persons, your largest is Syria, with almost 8 million now. Colombia is second. Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, Somalia are the other largest producing countries. I mean, they all have their own individual country context of why the war there is so ferocious and why there's so many people who are displaced either within or beyond their borders. You know, a lot of it has to do with some combination of poverty, access to weapons, internal repression, lack of democratic voice, and in some way, and also some form of environmental degradation that is causing competition for scarce resources. All of those are various aspects which are leading to this, and I think you can probably use all that criteria to figure out some variation of the explanation for each of those countries.
Peter?
I'd like it if the panel could offer their thoughts on, it seems like there might be some connection between the anti-Muslim sentiment that has taken hold both south of the border and here. Anti-Arab sentiment. We've seen pieces in the Times, studies showing that people that are, at least in the United States, in this sample, viewing Muslims as less than human, and perhaps the reticence to respond to this crisis. If there's some connection, I don't know.
You mean connection with the legislation and the process to accept refugees with the anti-Muslim?
It may go broader than that. I can certainly part of the sentiment with respect to the changes made to our security legislation around Bill C-51. I think there's a good argument to make that part is fueled by anti-Muslim sentiment. It's been cited recently that hate crimes, as reported by police in Canada, have actually gone down over the last 2 years, but they've actually spiked with respect to anti-Muslim episodes in Canada. So we're seeing a rise, if you like, in Islamophobia in Canada. You see that obviously in the United States as well, where it's quite proper for a leading contender for the Republican nomination to say a Muslim should never be considered to be qualified to serve as president of the United States. So that's, and it'd be hard to separate, I think, leading from that. The kind of opposition we see from the federal government today to allowing more refugees coming from Syria into Canada, with that overall sentiment that they're not adverse to wanting to use as a wedge issue during the current campaign.
And I would also add to that that September 19th announcement that I mentioned really made only vague generalizations about whether or not the Syrian refugees coming to Canada would be Muslims or would continue to be those from what the government continues to term religious and ethnic minorities, which are largely non-Muslim, right? So I think that there is a very clear link between some of that focus on the current popular sentiment that's being whipped up at this time and policy practices that are currently in place, or at least don't appear to be budging.
So we have time for, so Joanna wants to do a quick follow-up, and then I'll go to Musaiba, and then we'll, can I pronounce it right?
Yeah,
and then we'll.
The follow-up is, Stephanie, you had a great slide with the numbers that Canada has accepted across time.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about the Kosovo crisis, for example. And do you know what the Muslim-Christian ratio was? And was anti-Muslim sentiment bigger or as big then as it seems to be now? Because that seems to be a useful comparison.
That's a great question. I do know that I don't know the specific percentages of Muslim versus non-Muslim, but I do know that there was, I think, what I would characterize as a respectable number of Muslim migrants or Muslim refugees in that particular refugee reception period of 7,000 at that time. I would say the number is respectable. I can't give you the exact number. It's not in my head. I don't have it in front of me. It was one of those things I meant to Google because I figured it would be asked. But it's a respectable number in comparison to what we see now and to what we saw with the reception of the Ugandan Asians in 1972.
So my question kind of goes back to the title of the event, like, is what we're doing enough? Is it sufficient to address the refugee crisis the way the world kind of has been, where it looks at the Syrian civil war underpinnings as a private issue, then the ensuing and resulting refugee crisis? Is it sufficient for us to just think in terms of refugees without thinking of what's causing refugees, just to think of it symptomatically? Or do you think that that's historically or whatever it might be how we look at refugees in general? So.
I think that it's a complex issue. history it will teach us if you're doing things right or wrong. The 1951 Convention was created with an absolutely different frame. And I believe, and it's been debated right now, if this is going to be a test for the convention to finally say it's not applicable anymore because the world has changed and we need to take into consideration other different factors that actually are embedded in the migration. So I think that that's an interesting question that will be answered in the way that we respond to the crisis and in the results that we will see after responding to the crisis. Because right now we're seeing an immediate action of just moving people to safety. And then through the years, we will be able to follow up the process, how many of those refugees are returning to their countries because they failed their resettlement process, which is an important number that touches on sociology, that touches on culture, that touches on how the community is responding to the migration. Because after 5-4 years, they might go back because they were unable to resettle properly. So we will see that in the years coming, and I think it's going to be an important question that will be answered with time.
Great, thank you. So Professor Quinn has a few things to say.
I want to start first by saying thank you. I have a long list of thank yous. But thank you first, and I hope you'll join me in thanking the panelists, Lina and Stephanie and Lynk. I see him sneaking toward the door, but to thank Andrew for agreeing to chair this kind of panel, because it takes time out of the day to think about and so on, and so let's have a little thank you for Andrew.